Have you ever noticed how some people spend their entire lives chasing dreams that never seem to materialize? Yet they keep running toward the same mirage year after year. They don't stop to question. They don't pause to reflect. They simply keep looking outward, hoping the next achievement, the next relationship, the next external validation will finally fill the void inside them. And suddenly one day, they realize they've been running in circles their whole life. Now imagine if you did the opposite. If instead of constantly seeking outside yourself, you turned inward and discovered what you've been avoiding all along. That's where the point lies. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." But most people have completely misunderstood what this means. They think looking outside means being ambitious or goal-oriented. They think looking inside means navel-gazing or being selfish. But Jung wasn't talking about ambition versus introspection. He was talking about the difference between living in illusion and living in truth. And the truth is this: every dream you chase outside yourself is actually a projection of something you refuse to face within yourself. When you constantly seek validation, recognition, love, or meaning from the external world, you are essentially dreaming. You are living in a fantasy where your worth, your identity, your peace depends on circumstances beyond your control. But when you turn inward, when you have the courage to face what's actually there, your fears, your shadows, your authentic desires, that's when you awaken. That's when you stop being controlled by unconscious forces and start living from conscious choice. This video is not about abandoning your goals or becoming passive. It's about understanding why most of your external pursuits are actually elaborate escape mechanisms. It's about recognizing that the very things you think will save you are often the things that keep you trapped in cycles of disappointment and emptiness. So I ask you now, looking into your eyes, how long will you continue chasing dreams that belong to someone else's vision of who you should be? How long will you keep running from the one person you'll never be able to escape, yourself? Maybe it's time to stop dreaming and start awakening. You have been taught to look everywhere but inside yourself. From childhood, you've been conditioned to believe that happiness, success, and fulfillment come from external achievements, other people's approval, or the perfect set of circumstances aligning in your favor. But here's a truth that perhaps no one has told you with this clarity. This constant outward seeking is not ambition, it is avoidance. And as long as you continue to believe that your inner peace depends on external conditions, you will remain a prisoner of your own projections. Do you know why most people are terrified of silence, of stillness, of being alone with themselves? Because in those moments, when the noise stops and the distractions fade, they come face to face with what they've been running from their entire lives. The parts of themselves they don't want to acknowledge, the feelings they don't want to feel, the truths they don't want to accept. So instead, they stay busy. They chase career goals that don't align with their authentic nature. They seek relationships to fill emotional voids that can only be filled from within. They accumulate possessions, experiences, achievements, thinking that the next external thing will finally make them feel complete. But it doesn't work that way. Carl Jung spoke about projection, the psychological mechanism through which we see in the external world what we refuse to see in ourselves. When you're constantly seeking love from others, you're projecting your need for self-love. When you're chasing success to prove your worth, you're projecting your inability to accept your inherent value. When you're trying to control external circumstances to feel safe, you're projecting your fear of facing internal uncertainty. The cruel irony is that the more you look outside for what can only be found inside, the further you move from actually obtaining it. You become dependent on variables you cannot control. Your mood depends on other people's moods. Your self-worth depends on external achievements. Your peace depends on circumstances being just right. And since circumstances are always changing, you live in a constant state of anxiety, always one external shift away from losing your stability. But here's what most people don't realize. Every external desire is actually a symbolic representation of an internal need. When you understand this, everything changes. That desperate need for recognition, it's your soul asking you to recognize yourself. That craving for the perfect relationship, it's your psyche demanding that you develop a loving relationship with all parts of yourself, including the parts you've rejected. That hunger for success and achievement. It's often your authentic self, trying to emerge from beneath layers of conditioning and other people's expectations. The tragedy is that most people spend decades, sometimes entire lifetimes, chasing external dreams that can never satisfy them because they're not addressing the internal reality that created the external hunger in the first place. They're trying to solve an inner equation with outer variables, and it never works. But what happens when you stop? What happens when you finally turn inward and face what you've been avoiding? That's what we need to understand next. Because looking inside doesn't just mean sitting quietly and thinking about yourself. It means having the courage to confront the parts of your psyche that you've been denying, suppressing, or projecting onto the world. And that requires understanding what Jung called the shadow. In the next part, we will explore why most of your external dreams are actually elaborate disguises for internal work you're avoiding. And we'll uncover why the very thing you think will destroy you, facing your inner darkness, is actually the only thing that can set you free. Because until you integrate your shadow, you'll keep chasing shadows in the external world, mistaking them for substance. Carl Jung understood something that most people never grasp. The human psyche doesn't operate in isolation. Everything you perceive outside yourself is filtered through your internal psychological landscape. This means that your external world is essentially a mirror reflecting your internal state back to you. But most people have this backwards. They think if they can just change the external circumstances, their internal state will change. But Jung discovered the opposite is true. When you look outside and see lack, you're actually seeing your own internal sense of inadequacy. When you look outside and see threat, you're seeing your own internal fears projected onto the world. When you look outside and see emptiness, you're seeing your own disconnection from your authentic self. The external world isn't causing these feelings, it's revealing them. This is why two people can experience the exact same external situation and have completely different responses. One person loses their job and sees it as a catastrophe, while another sees it as liberation. One person faces rejection and feels worthless, while another uses it as information to redirect their energy. The external circumstance is the same, but the internal landscape determines the experience. But here's where it gets really interesting. Jung discovered that what you resist in yourself, you will unconsciously seek to complete through external relationships and circumstances. If you've rejected your own anger, you'll find yourself repeatedly attracted to angry people or situations that provoke anger. If you've denied your own vulnerability, you'll either seek out relationships where you can be the strong one, or you'll be attracted to people who embody the vulnerability you've disowned. This is why your dreams, your external pursuits, often feel so compulsive. They're not really choices. They're unconscious attempts to balance internal psychological equations. You're not chasing success. You're trying to prove you're not a failure. You're not seeking love. You're trying to convince yourself you're lovable. You're not pursuing security. You're trying to control your fear of uncertainty. The problem is that external achievements can never resolve internal psychological conflicts. You can accumulate all the external validation in the world, But if you haven't faced your own internal self-rejection, you'll never feel truly validated. You can achieve every external marker of success, but if you haven't dealt with your internal sense of inadequacy, you'll never feel successful. Do you know what happens to people who achieve their external dreams but haven't done the internal work? They feel empty. They experience what psychologists call arrival syndrome, the crushing realization that getting what you thought you wanted doesn't actually change how you feel about yourself. This is why so many successful people struggle with depression, why so many people who achieve their goals immediately set new ones, why external achievement often leads to internal spiritual crisis. Jung said that the first half of life is about establishing yourself in the world, but the second half is about finding meaning. But what he really meant is that the first half is about looking outside, and the second half is about looking inside. The tragedy is that most people never make this transition. They spend their entire lives looking outside, dreaming, projecting, seeking completion through external means. But what does it actually mean to look inside? It's not just introspection or self-analysis. It's having the courage to face your shadow, all the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or hidden from consciousness. Your anger, your selfishness, your fears, your desires, your authentic needs that you've learned to suppress because they weren't acceptable to your family, your culture, your conditioning. Most of your external dreams are elaborate attempts to avoid this internal confrontation. You'd rather chase an impossible external ideal than face the reality of who you actually are. But Jung understood that integration, not achievement, is the path to wholeness. And integration requires looking directly at what you've been avoiding. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when you finally stop running from yourself, when you stop projecting your internal landscape onto external circumstances and start taking responsibility for your own psychological wholeness. Because this is where the real transformation begins, not in achieving your dreams, but in understanding why you needed to dream those particular dreams in the first place. You think your dreams are about what you want. You believe your external pursuits are conscious choices based on your desires, values, and aspirations. But the truth is darker and more liberating than you might imagine. Most of what you chase outside yourself is actually determined by what you're running from inside yourself. Your dreams are often elaborate escape mechanisms disguised as ambitions. Carl Jung called this projection, but it goes deeper than most people understand. You don't just project your internal conflicts onto other people. You project them onto your entire life path. You choose careers that allow you to avoid facing certain aspects of yourself. You seek relationships that let you play familiar roles rather than confront your authentic needs. You set goals that keep you busy enough to avoid the uncomfortable silence where real self-knowledge lives. Let me show you how this works. If you've learned that your worth depends on being needed, you'll unconsciously seek out situations where people depend on you. Your dream might be to be a healer, a helper, a rescuer. But underneath this noble aspiration is often a terror of being seen as selfish or unnecessary. You're not following your authentic calling. You're running from your fear of not being valuable. If you've internalized the message that you're not enough as you are, you'll chase external markers of enoughness. Your dream might be wealth, status, recognition, or achievement. But you're not really seeking these things for their own sake. You're trying to build an external identity strong enough to protect you from your internal sense of inadequacy. If you've rejected your own emotional needs, you might dream of perfect independence, of needing no one, of being completely self-sufficient. But this isn't strength, it's avoidance. You're creating an external reality that mirrors your internal rejection of vulnerability. The most insidious part is that these unconscious patterns often masquerade as spiritual or personal growth goals. You tell yourself you want to help others, achieve success, or become independent, because these sound like positive aspirations. But Jung understood that our most noble-seeming external pursuits can be our most sophisticated forms of self-deception. This is why achieving your external dreams often feels hollow. You finally get the recognition you thought you wanted, but instead of satisfaction, you feel empty. You achieve the independence you thought would make you strong, but instead you feel isolated. You build the successful career you thought would prove your worth, but you still feel inadequate. The external achievement can never resolve the internal conflict because the external pursuit was never really about what you claimed it was about. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable. Your external dreams don't just reflect what you're avoiding in yourself, they often perpetuate it. When you chase external validation to avoid feeling your internal unworthiness, you're actually reinforcing the belief that your worth comes from outside yourself. When you pursue perfect independence to avoid vulnerability, you're strengthening the very fear that drives the pursuit. You become trapped in cycles where your solutions become your problems. The more you seek love outside yourself, the more disconnected you become from self-love. The more you chase external security, the more internally anxious you become. The more you try to control external circumstances, the more out of control you feel inside. This is what Jung meant when he said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to better understanding of ourselves. But it goes beyond just other people. Everything you're desperately seeking in the external world is pointing you towards something you need to integrate within yourself. The person chasing fame is often running from their fear of being insignificant. The person pursuing perfect relationships is often avoiding their relationship with themselves. The person obsessed with financial security is often trying to control their existential anxiety about uncertainty and mortality. But what happens when you finally see through these patterns? What happens when you recognize that your external dreams have been internal avoidance strategies? This is where the real work begins. And this is where most people turn back, because looking inside requires facing the very things you've organized your entire life around avoiding. In the next part, we'll explore what it actually means to look inside, to awaken from the dream of external completion. But I'll warn you now, this path requires giving up the comfortable illusion that your problems can be solved by changing your circumstances. It requires taking full responsibility for your internal landscape. It requires meeting yourself completely, including the parts you've spent a lifetime trying to escape. Are you ready for that level of honesty? Are you prepared to discover that the very dreams you think define you might actually be the barriers keeping you from awakening to who you really are? The modern world has made looking outside not just acceptable, but mandatory. You are surrounded by messages telling you that happiness comes from the next purchase, the next achievement, the next relationship, the next experience. The entire economic and social system depends on your continued externalization of fulfillment. But this constant outward focus has created an epidemic of inner emptiness that no amount of external stimulation can fill. Most people have become strangers to themselves. They know what they want to achieve, but they don't know why they want it. They can list their goals, but they can't identify their authentic desires. They can describe their dreams, but they can't explain where these dreams actually came from or whether they even belong to them. Carl Jung understood that this disconnection from inner reality creates what he called spiritual poverty in the midst of material abundance. You can have everything the external world says should make you happy and still feel fundamentally empty because you've lost contact with your inner source of meaning and direction. But looking inside is not popular because it's inconvenient. It doesn't fit into the cultural narrative of constant progress and external achievement. It requires slowing down in a world that values speed. It demands stillness in a culture that equates busyness with importance. It asks for depth in a society that rewards surface-level performance. So what does it actually mean to look inside, to awaken from the dream of external completion? It means developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between your conscious desires and your unconscious motivations, between who you think you are and who you actually are, between what you think you want and what your soul is actually seeking. This process begins with radical honesty about your internal landscape. Not the story you tell yourself about why you want what you want, but the raw, unfiltered truth about what's actually driving your choices. When you strip away the justifications, the noble-sounding explanations, the socially acceptable reasons, what's left? For most people, what's left is fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of being abandoned, fear of being seen as they truly are, fear of their own power, fear of their own darkness, fear of meaninglessness, fear of death. These fears drive most external pursuits, but they remain unconscious, disguised as positive motivations. Looking inside means facing these fears directly, not trying to solve them through external achievement. It means sitting with the discomfort of not knowing who you are beneath all the roles you play. It means experiencing the anxiety of not having external distractions to avoid internal emptiness. But here's what Jung discovered. When you stop running from your internal reality, it stops chasing you. When you face your fears directly, they lose their unconscious power over your choices. When you acknowledge your shadow, it stops controlling you from the darkness. This doesn't mean the fears disappear or that internal conflicts get resolved quickly. But something profound shifts when you stop trying to solve internal problems through external means. You develop what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to be with yourself completely, without needing external circumstances to be different. When you look inside and awaken, several things happen simultaneously. First, your external pursuits become conscious choices, rather than unconscious compulsions. You might still want to achieve certain goals, but you're no longer driven by unconscious fears or trying to compensate for internal deficits. Second, you stop projecting your internal state onto external circumstances. You realize that how you feel is not primarily determined by what happens to you, but by your relationship with what happens to you. This gives you tremendous freedom because you're no longer at the mercy of external variables. Third, you discover authentic desires that have been buried under layers of conditioning, trauma, and societal expectations. You begin to sense what you actually want, not what you think you should want or what others want for you. But this awakening process is not comfortable. Jung warned that looking inside requires what he called suffering the tension of opposites. You have to hold space for conflicting desires, contradictory impulses, uncomfortable truths about yourself. You can no longer maintain the simple narratives about who you are and what you want. Most people turn back at this point. They prefer the familiar suffering of external seeking to the unfamiliar discomfort of internal awakening. They choose the known prison of projection over the unknown freedom of psychological integration. But for those who continue, who have the courage to keep looking inside even when it's uncomfortable, something extraordinary begins to emerge. A different kind of strength, a different kind of peace, a different relationship with both success and failure, with both having and not having. In the final part, we'll explore what this awakened life actually looks like. What happens when you no longer need external validation to feel worthy? When you no longer need external circumstances to be perfect to feel peaceful? When you no longer need to dream because you're finally awake? Because this is where the real magic happens, not in achieving your external dreams, but in discovering that you never needed them to be complete. When you finally stop looking outside for what can only be found inside, something remarkable happens. The constant striving ends, not because you become passive or lose ambition, but because you no longer need external achievement to feel whole. Your actions come from fullness rather than emptiness, from conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation, becoming who you truly are, requires separating yourself from collective expectations and finding your own center. When you awaken from the dream of external completion, you begin to live from this center. Your decisions are no longer determined by what others expect, what society rewards, or what your conditioning demands. They come from a deeper place of authentic knowing. This doesn't mean you stop having goals or cease to interact with the external world, but your relationship with outcomes completely transforms. You can work toward external objectives without being attached to them for your sense of identity or worth. You can pursue dreams that align with your authentic nature, rather than dreams designed to compensate for internal deficits. People often ask what awakened life looks like practically. Does it mean becoming a hermit, abandoning worldly pursuits, or losing drive and ambition? The answer is both simpler and more complex than that. When you look inside and awaken, you become more genuinely engaged with life, not less. But your engagement comes from a different source. Instead of chasing external validation, you become internally validated. This doesn't make you arrogant or disconnected from others. It makes you more authentic in your relationships because you're no longer using other people to fill internal voids or complete your sense of self. Instead of seeking security through external control, you develop internal security. You become comfortable with uncertainty because you're no longer threatened by circumstances beyond your control. Your peace doesn't depend on everything going according to plan. Instead of pursuing external markers of success to prove your worth, you act from your inherent value. This often leads to greater external success, but success that feels meaningful because it's aligned with your authentic nature, rather than driven by unconscious fears. The most profound change is in your relationship with failure and disappointment. When you're no longer seeking completion through external means, setbacks become information rather than disasters. Rejection becomes redirection rather than invalidation. Loss becomes an opportunity for deeper self-discovery rather than evidence of your inadequacy. But let me be honest about the cost of this awakening. You will lose some relationships, particularly those based on your willingness to play roles that kept others comfortable. You will become incomprehensible to people who knew you as the person who sought their approval or needed their validation. Some people will interpret your inner stability as arrogance. Others will feel threatened by your lack of neediness. Those who benefited from your external seeking might pressure you to return to old patterns. This is normal and necessary. As you change, your relationships must either evolve or end. You will also experience periods of loneliness as you separate from collective dreams and discover your individual path. Jung called this the loneliness of the awakening soul. But this loneliness is different from the emptiness of external seeking. It's full rather than hollow, pregnant with possibility rather than desperate for distraction. The most challenging aspect might be giving up the familiar identity of being someone who's trying to become someone else. When you stop chasing external dreams, you also stop being able to tell yourself that happiness is just one achievement away. You have to face the reality that you are enough as you are right now, which can be terrifying for someone who's organized their entire life around becoming different. But here's what emerges from this process: a life of unprecedented authenticity and inner freedom. You become truly creative because you're no longer copying templates of success created by others. You develop genuine compassion because you've faced your own darkness and can hold space for others' shadows without judgment. You discover that real strength isn't the ability to control external circumstances, but the capacity to remain centered, regardless of what happens around you. Real security isn't having external guarantees, but knowing you can handle whatever life presents. Real love isn't being needed by others, but being so complete in yourself that your love becomes a gift rather than a transaction. Most importantly, you stop living in the future tense. Instead of constantly reaching for the next external thing that will supposedly complete you, you become present to the richness of this moment, this experience, this breath. You realize that the completeness you were seeking externally was always available internally. You just had to stop looking outside long enough to notice it. Carl Jung spent his life helping people make this transition from dreaming to awakening, from external seeking to internal integration. He understood that this is not just personal development, it's spiritual evolution. It's the difference between living unconsciously, driven by forces you don't understand, and living consciously, aware of your motivations and free to choose your responses. Now I ask you, are you ready to stop dreaming and start awakening? Are you prepared to give up the comfortable prison of external seeking for the unknown freedom of internal wholeness? Are you willing to face whatever you've been avoiding in yourself, even if it means losing the identity you've built around not having it? The path of awakening is not for everyone. It requires tremendous courage to face yourself completely, to give up external crutches, to stand in the unknown territory of your authentic being. But for those ready to make this journey, it's the only path that leads to genuine freedom, lasting peace, and authentic fulfillment. If this message has stirred something in you, if you recognize yourself in these patterns of external seeking, write in the comments, "I choose to awaken." Let's see how many are ready to stop chasing shadows and start embracing the light of their own consciousness. And don't forget, keep watching the next video, where we'll explore the practical steps for beginning this inner journey. Because understanding these concepts intellectually is only the beginning. The real work starts when you close your eyes, turn inward, and begin the sacred process of meeting yourself completely. The time for dreaming is over. The time for awakening has begun.